applicable and important research. The Rappahannock River is a perfect size. It's not too big, not too small, which lends itself to a broad spectrum of research. And we also have an excellent amount of needs, from habitat loss, conversion, high levels of development, sea level rise impacting coastal communities. We have very productive farms, forests, and other things. So there's a lot of stakeholders that this research can benefit. And I do, as I mentioned in my emails, I do encourage folks on the phone to ask these researchers questions during the Q&A. They are looking for feedback from the local governments, the organizations and collaboratives that are doing work on the ground as to what kinds of data and future research would benefit their programs and projects. So Eldon, I don't know if you prefer questions in the chat box that you can pose to the presenters, or how you'd like to do that. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the folks that have generously donated their time for this presentation.
Well, since you asked me a question, let's just go ahead with the presentation. If folks want to post something in the chat box, once we get done with the presentation, I'll call on folks and you can unmute and ask your question. So Kim, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for all of you donating your time to us to come and talk to you today virtually. So I'm Kim Komatsu. I work at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So we're up in Edgewater, Maryland. And I'll just introduce the other co-presenters quickly for this presentation. So we have Matt Ogburn, also with me up at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland. And then Amy Johnson and Yara Locker are both at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute down in Front Royal in Virginia. But we're all coming together across these two different units within the Smithsonian. We have relatively new funding from an anonymous donor through a program called Working Land and Seascapes. So this is a Smithsonian initiative where we're really trying to not just study nature in the small nature preserves that are left, but really integrate working lands and working seas, people's livelihoods into the research that we're doing. And the goal is still, of course, to benefit nature, but also to benefit people as well. So we just want to quickly tell you a little bit about some of the ongoing work that we have in the Rappahannock River Basin right now, or some of it is in adjacent localities. But then going forward, like I said, we have this new funding for a small pilot project, and we're really looking for data streams or ideas, ways that we could generate scientific information that could really help all of you make decisions when you're on the ground doing this work or planning for policy. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can you all see the presentation here? Great. Okay. So again, what are we doing here today? So we really want the science that we do. We're primarily scientists first. So we're doing research, and we want that research to be useful to the community. So we think that all of you are really essential for this, because you're the people who are, again, on the ground implementing the conservation practices or coming up with decisions of how to protect land, but also how to maintain its function for people. And so we are going to tell you a little bit about our ongoing Smithsonian research, but then the main goal is just for us to be here to let you know that we exist and we are here, and we would love to talk to you more if you ever need information to inform your decision-making process. We're here for you, and we would love to have you get in touch with us. So what we are is a team of scientists from the Smithsonian. We span a really wide range of specialties. So we're working from the Blue Ridge Mountains all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay. And we think about lots of different processes. So we're thinking about land use change, so potentially conversion to urban centers or suburban centers, or agricultural change, and what that means for things like plant and bird diversity across the landscape, what it means for water quality, so runoff into our streams and rivers, and then what that means downstream for populations of fish, for the health of the bay, populations of oysters, and all the way out into the ocean as well. And so our goal is to, again, really do science that's going to support impactful conservation action. thinking about these working landscapes and working seascapes. And so there's a whole bunch of us on this team. There's just 4 of us on the call today to talk about the science that we're doing. So myself, Kim Komatsu, as well as I mentioned, Amy Johnson, Yara Locker, and Matt Ogburn. But then we have a bunch of other postdoctoral fellows. So these are other scientists here at the Smithsonian that are working on these kinds of questions, as well as Meredith Hickman and Julie are joining us today. They're both more on the public communication side. So they're the people who are better at talking to everybody on the ground, the general public, as opposed to the scientists who were not as good at it. And so why are we focusing on the Rappahannock? As Brian mentioned, it's the perfect size. It's not too big, it's not too small. But we love this region also because there's such a strong community commitment and engagement to conservation already. We're also fortunate that we have several Smithsonian projects already existing in the region, which we'll tell you a little bit about. So we have this long-term data that we can build upon, and not only Smithsonian data, but also data from lots of different partners in the area that have been working to collect information over a long time period. And then, of course, it's a really beautiful and unique ecosystem. There's unique biodiversity, and it highlights this interface between the land and the water and how important that interface is to study. So we're just going to tell you about 4 different maybe 5. I forgot to list the oysters in here. Sorry, Matt. 5 different projects that we kind of have ongoing right now to give you an idea of the types of science that we're doing in the region. But again, as I mentioned, we'd love to talk more and hear more after we're done here about your needs and the information that you would like to see. So we'll start out with Amy.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Johnson. I'm the program director for Virginia Working Landscapes, which is a program of Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. So we're based out of the Front Royal campus, as Eldon was talking about earlier. And most of the work that we have done thus far focuses on grassland management for biodiversity. So collaborating with a network of landowners, citizen scientists, and partnering organizations, a lot of conservation organizations in the region, and working together to study how land use and land management impacts our biodiversity. We've also been working with some partners like Yara Locker, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, to venture into some forest ecosystems looking at orchid communities. But today I'll just focus on some of the work we've been doing in grasslands and its relevancy to the conversation that we're having today. So to start out, next slide, Kim. Our research thus far has focused mostly in grassland communities and looking at how different management techniques can impact biodiversity. So for example, looking at how native warm season grass restorations are impacting our bird communities, both in the breeding season as well as in the winter, but also looking at different methods to establish and manage warm season grasses, and looking at everything from the soil to invasive species and how management can either help invasive species proliferate or help the native species proliferate. Next slide, Kim. One of our ongoing projects right now is in collaboration with the Clifton Institute, as well as with the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. And we're looking at methods to establish and manage native warm season grasses. So we're looking at both conventional methods using herbicide, using burning, but also organic methods using excessive tillage and cover crops, and studying every moment of the process and learning all of the challenges and opportunities that landowners are going through while they're working through conversions. And the goal of this study is to really help us better understand how different soil types, how different vegetation communities in different areas might respond to these different warm season grass establishment methods, as well as the management methods. Next slide, Kim. And another one of our, I don't think the slide advanced yet. Oh, there we go. Another project we're working on right now is in collaboration with American Farmland Trust. They've just initiated a sustainable grazing initiative in this region and are working with producers to incorporate rotational grazing methods to improve herd health, to improve pasture condition, And we got together with American Farmland Trust and saw that a lot of these practices are likely also benefiting biodiversity. And so we brought on a team of avian technicians this past summer to initiate a study looking at grassland bird nesting success on the same fields where the Sustainable Grazing Project is helping producers with rotational grazing practices. Next slide. And what we're learning from this is how different regenerative grazing practices can potentially be helping grassland birds reproduce. Now, these species nest directly on the ground, so they can be severely impacted by trampling, from haying, from herbicide use. And so we're looking at how different practices that are adopted by these producers through the Sustainable Grazing Project might be impacting grassland birds. So for example, this past summer, we learned that setting aside fields for winter stockpiling or winter grazing can really set aside some excellent nesting habitat for grassland birds. And we saw a really high number of our grassland bird species like eastern meadowlarks, bobolinks, and grasshopper sparrows successfully reproducing and actually fledging young. That photo on the far right is a 1 day post-fledged bobolink in a field that was set aside for winter grazing. So there's definitely some practices that are being adopted in the region that can benefit both the cattle producer as well as grassland bird communities. So we're going to be working on this project over the next several years to help refine these practices so that we're able to use what we learn from the science to help inform management for both people as well as biodiversity. Next slide. And then as a result of research like this, we can come up with recommendations for how to manage fields for grassland birds and other biodiversity. So for example, this is a calendar that we came up with using data from our wintering grassland bird research as well as our breeding grass bird research to demonstrate which times of year these bird communities are most vulnerable when it comes to managing fields. And we'll constantly come back to this and refine it as we can continue learning new information from the research we're doing. So that's just a summary of some of the work that we're doing in grasslands. Our goal with Virginia Working Landscapes is to gain insights from the community, from landowners who really are the major land stewards in our region and are responsible for the conservation and preservation of our region's biodiversity, and learn what practices they're using, what they're interested in conserving and how, and then how our science can help inform how to do that. So if you have any insights on what types of research projects you'd like to see, we work with a network of over 100 citizen scientists that help us conduct our ecological research on private lands throughout a 16 county region surrounding Shenandoah National Park. So we're always excited to be collaborating and open to discussion. So thanks for listening. We'll pass it over to Kim.
Great, thanks, Amy. So keeping with the agricultural theme, but moving away from rangeland and into crop production. So a portion of the work that I do, a lot of this takes place up in Maryland, but there is a lot of soybean down in Virginia as well. So it's definitely applicable to the region. So we're working in soybeans. Soybeans are the second largest crop in the United States by acre and by dollar value. And I calculated yesterday that there's about 118,000 acres of soybean planted within the Rappahannock watershed every year. And so the US is the world leader in production of soybeans. So it's really an economically valuable crop for the country, but also for the region. And it's a somewhat more environmentally friendly crop because you don't have to use nitrogen fertilizer as much. So soybeans, they have this special relationship with a certain kind of bacteria called rhizobia. And the rhizobial bacteria live within the roots of the soybeans and they provide nitrogen to the plant. And so soybeans and all members of the bean and pea family are called nitrogen fixers because they can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So nitrogen gas in the air, this bacteria converts it into a form that the plants can use. And so you don't have to use as much fertilizer on these crops, at least as much nitrogen fertilizer, which can be really beneficial When you think about crop rotation with things like corn that do need much more nitrogen availability, it can really help reduce pollution downstream runoff of these fertilizers. But soybeans are, because they're so high in nitrogen, they're very tasty to lots of animals and bugs in particular. So they require relatively high pesticide use to try and keep down this insect damage. And we know that these pesticides can also run off into our waterways, which is having negative effects. And then in addition, soybean is primarily in the United States and in this region in particular, it's rainfall watered. So we don't irrigate our crops of soybean like we would wheat or corn. And because of this, they can be pretty sensitive to drought. So if we're seeing more droughts in the future, we might see more potential stress on these plants and damage to this economically important crop. And so I mentioned soybeans form this association with these special kind of bacteria that provide them with nitrogen. And typically, when we're planting soybeans, a lot of the seed producers will coat the soybeans with special seed coats. These often contain pesticides or fungicides, but they'll sometimes contain these bacteria as well. And they often just put a coating of one strain or one species, you could call it, of this bacteria on the soybeans. And then you plant your whole field with that one species of bacteria. And what we're finding is that actually having multiple different species of these bacteria associated with one plant can really help the plant do better under conditions of drought or under high conditions or high outbreaks of herbivores. And so we're looking to see whether we can promote using this really diverse bacterial community in these agricultural fields to reduce our reliance on pesticides or to reduce the failure of these crops under drought in the future. And so again, mostly we're doing this work up in Maryland. There's a lot of soybean on the Eastern Shore, but it's certainly relevant to the region as well. And we can definitely expand the work down into the Rappahannock River Basin. So then I'm going to hand it over. We're going to switch from terrestrial to aquatic. I'm going to hand it over to Matt here.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So again, my name is Matt Ogburn. I lead the Fisheries Conservation Lab at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland. And my lab does a variety of different kinds of research on fishery species, everything from clams and blue crabs and sharks and rays, which I'm not talking about today. But we also do a lot of work on migratory fish like river herring and shad that are really important in the Rappahannock River. And we are doing a lot of work on oyster reefs as well. The work that we're doing on herring and shad is really focused on trying to get a better understanding of their habitat use and throughout the Chesapeake watershed and what habitats are most important for their spawning and reproduction when they come in from the ocean each spring to spawn. And the Rappahannock has been a particularly interesting place for that because of the ability there to try to understand after the removal of Embry Dam 15 years or so ago, how the fish are using habitats that were opened up throughout the most of the upper Rappahannock. And there are also, as I understand, a number of ongoing efforts to try to continue to open up habitat through additional dam removals. So some of the work we're doing can help inform that as well. So we've been doing a couple of different things. In other systems, we've been doing run counts and genetics to really try to understand how many fish are there and how related they are from one stream to the next. And then throughout the watershed, including in the Rappahannock, we've developed a method to take a water sample and analyze the DNA that's coming off the fish into the water to determine if the fish is there. And we're continuing to work to develop the method to try to get an estimate of how many fish might be there, not just whether they're present or not. So we've taken a couple sets of samples in the Rappahannock watershed showing how river herring are moving up into the watershed following the dam removal. And then we've been taking some additional samples that we're waiting to get processed that are going to, I think, lay the groundwork for understanding how those populations might continue to shift their distribution. For example, if the Rapidan Dam is removed in the near future, we've been collecting some data, preliminary data for that. Some of the samples we collected that we just mentioned, we've been working with the Virginia Working Landscapes group that Amy has and some of their citizen scientists to collect some of those samples as well. And I think there's a lot more opportunity to do that. The photos in this slide, the bottom one is a photo of some river herring in Maryland. And then the top two photos are Bloody Dam, which is on the Patapsco River right near Baltimore, Maryland, near the BWI airport. The dam was removed about 1.5 years ago. It was a 30-foot tall dam on the top left, and then the top right photo is what it looks like now after the dam was removed. So it's another case like in the Rappahannock where we're studying response to dam removal. The last thing I'll say about river herring is that one of the other researchers working with me, Henry Leggett, is interested in the relationship between stream temperature and the times and places where river herring and shad spawn. And so he's going to be doing some work in the Rappahannock this coming spring to really try to understand how land use and water management, like dams and reservoirs, impact stream temperature and what that might mean for fish spawning runs. Next slide. So the oyster work that we're doing, this work is also Chesapeake Bay wide, but includes the Rappahannock. We've been really interested in understanding what oyster reefs look like throughout the bay and using GoPro cameras to get pictures of those. So just as a couple of examples here, the top image is from the Rappahannock, one of the harvested reefs. I can't tell you which oyster bar this is. I'd have to go back into the data. But this is one that we surveyed just this past fall, or this fall. And then the bottom image is from the Harris Creek oyster restoration in Maryland, which at the time was one of the largest, or was the largest oyster restoration in the world. Now there's another one in the Chesapeake that's a little bit bigger, but gives you a sense of what a harvested reef looks like versus a really intensively restored reef that is about 5 years after restoration. So we're interested in how oyster reefs look under different management conditions, how the habitat value differs between wild harvest reefs, aquaculture sites, and restored protected reefs, and then really interested in understanding how oyster reefs in the Chesapeake work now that there's more restoration going on. So in the Rappahannock, we've done a survey of about 50 different sites in the lower part of the Rappahannock to try to understand the oyster reefs there, and we'll be happy to share those data as they come together. But we're using the Rappahannock as a comparison site for the 5 tributaries that the Chesapeake Bay program is restoring in Virginia. And similarly in Maryland, we're studying the 5 major restoration tributaries there, plus 1 comparison site. So we view the Rappahannock as an important example for comparison with the large scale oyster restoration that's going on in some other places.
Great, thanks, Matt. So then we'll hand it over last to Yara.
Hi, everybody. So the Changing Landscapes Initiative is what I'm going to talk to you about today. This is an initiative I've been working on developing over the past several years, and we are really focused on the landscape perspective, so kind of macroecology, large-scale interactions between land use and impacts on ecosystems. And we use scenario planning as a framework for our work, and this actually, as I'll show you, allows us to integrate the feedback from regional community experts, stakeholders, and scientists to develop science that is relevant and hopefully useful to everybody here. Next slide. So our mission is to combine scientific rigor and community wisdom to help secure a vibrant and healthy future for people and wildlife. Next slide. We are currently focused on a 15-county region surrounding the Shenandoah National Park, which is shown here in dark green. This region was originally selected because of interest from the Shenandoah to understand how land use around the region was impacting the park, but also to be able to better communicate the benefits that the park provides to the communities that surround it. We are using this as a pilot area, and we're finishing up our majority of our research here. And now we're really focused on communications and outreach and the integration of our tools into planning and policy and decision-making in the region. Next slide. So our primary questions are, how will land use decisions that we make today, next, impact the things that we care about tomorrow? And so for Changing Landscapes Initiative, as is the case with all these projects that are being presented to you today, what we're really interested in is understanding, the impacts of human activity on ecosystem function as measured by various facets of biodiversity, but also the contribution of this function to ecosystem services, which benefit the people living within this area. Next slide. So our question for CLI for us is, what can we do as scientists to support planning that protects ecosystems and thus our quality of life in our not just current but future home? And in order to do this, we need to both understand our landscape and also create information that is of value. Next slide. So really important in achieving this goal is the intersection of people and science. So removing the scientific practice from that of producing the science and then handing it out to people at the end of the process, really integrating the feedback from the community in the development of the research questions, of course, with guidance from scientific community, in order to produce information that would be relevant and useful for the decisions that are impacting you all as they happen. So next slide. As I said, scenario planning is a primary framework for the work that CLI conducts. What we've done is worked with a group of various stakeholders within the region to develop a suite of narratives or storylines of what the potential future could be. And these are driven by primary drivers of change also identified by this group. So these primary drivers of change for us in our 15-county region is the intersection of population change and then political will. Political will meaning the ability of the community or the will of the community to take or strive for a certain degree of perspective within their region. So what is it that they desire and their ability to work towards that future? And so we've ended up with 4 scenarios for the Changing Landscapes Initiative, each which represent the intersection of these drivers. And if you have questions about this specifically, just feel free to contact me. Next slide. We take those scenarios of the future and then translate them, that qualitative data, those storylines, into data, so quantitative data that can be turned into models that project future land use in the region. And we've got this for all of those 4 future scenarios for a 50-year horizon from 2011 data that we started with, and then also a business as usual plan. So again, if this is something you're interested in or would like to learn more about, please just reach out. Next slide, please. Then we take this information and we apply it to understand the potential impacts of that land use change on those things that we care about. So what does this mean now for the fragmentation of forests or forest connectivity? What does this mean for the diversity and abundance of certain species that are important here, like mammals, pollinators, orchid species, or species that can be used as indicators of change? What does it mean for water quality? So we've recently completed a full analysis of water quality across this region for 16 water quality metrics. And now this data is also can be packaged up and is ready to share with whoever would like to have it. Next slide, please. Now, what we've learned in our work is that this data, these maps are really useful for people who understand them. But in order to garner support for your cause, you really need to be speaking to a broader audience. So we've combined efforts with a well-known, talented group of graphic designers in the region to develop tools that would be useful for you actually garnering public support for your cause. Next slide, please. Actually, can you go back one, Kim? Thank you. So if you look at this image right here at the top right of the photo above that tree, you can kind of see this is a little bit of change. So I didn't include all the maps because I want the presentation to be succinct, but this image represents a viewshed from Massanutten. So this is the southern part of the Blue Ridge here in our 15 county region that looks out to the southwest. And this represents the strategic view of the 50-year timeline. So there's a few new developments in here that are really, occurring on the outskirts, but they're not. What this illustrates is that our scenario for the strategic planning scenario groups new development closer to existing urban development. So this is a reduction of the potential impact of that development on your viewshed. Now, if you do look at the next slide in the same region, you can see that the build out is substantially larger. So this scenario represents sprawl. Sprawl here is essentially business as usual trend. So this is all driven by the model. And so it represents the storylines and also the data in a way that I think is a little bit more digestible and impactful for the general public, which may be useful to you all in garnering support for the introduction of science into comprehensive plans, river planning efforts, community engagement efforts, etc. All right, I think that might be it. Yep, thank you very much.
Great. So that's, I guess, a smattering of the projects that we work on, and we tried to keep it relatively brief because we wanted mostly to be hearing from all of you. So we'd love to answer any questions you might have, but also we would love to hear from you what science we could do that would be helpful to you in making decisions and making these plans. And of course, feel free to contact us anytime going forward as well. So myself or Meredith Hickman is our communications and outreach specialist on the project. But you can get in touch with any of us. You can find our information through the Smithsonian website. And we'd love to help you out now or in the future in whatever way we possibly can. And I guess I'll say, if there's any questions we can't answer, we could hopefully point you towards someone who could answer them as well.
Thank you, Kim, and to all of your team. There were several comments in the chat box, and actually there was some dialogue going back and forth answering them. But for the benefit of those of us who are not real good at listening and reading comments at the same time, I'm going to call on Scott Ray to unmute and ask his question. And after Scott, I'm going to call on Deirdre. So be ready, Deirdre. Scott, you there? Okay, well, Deirdre, go right ahead.
Yeah, my question focused on any studies that were looking into the impacts of industrial scale solar facilities on biodiversity, the land-water interface that was mentioned, and basic connectivity more to areas east of the fall line. However, in the Culpeper region recently, I think it was actually just yesterday, a 1,000 acre industrial scale proposal was turned down by the Board of Supervisors as simply being too large. Most of our producers, as you know, are not on a very generous income. They're looking for ways to use their land in a productive manner. And most solar scale, or most industrial scale solar marketers approach these landowners with rather generous lease agreements that are challenging to interpret and apply to their situation, but also with the promise of that land being returned to usability in the future once those facilities are have reached their capacity or maxed out or changed in technology or whatever. So my question was, are there any ongoing studies? I see that Laura has answered that, and a way that I can answer her question is, might you all be available for presentations at planning commission meetings, supervisors meetings, et cetera, as some of these applications for the installation of these facilities present themselves? Yeah,
thanks, Deidre. It's really timely that you've asked this. We are, at the beginning stages of exploring this question. There is some research that exists, I think, you know, nationally and globally, of the impact of solar farms on what you've mentioned here, but it's not very in depth, and I think there is more needed. Amy and I have been we've been reached out to by a group that's looking into, you know, examining this question more in depth. And I think that we'll know more over the course of the next year. But I'm sure that if that pans out and we feel confident in talking to people, that we both would. And I'm speaking for her here, but yeah, I think she would.
Yeah.
It just
That'd be great. I know that. Hi, Amy. I know that this issue has been explored in some depth in North Carolina, but as you know, each region has its way of dealing with issues and communicating with the broader public. So, you know, I welcome your ability in, you know, kind of threading that needle and maybe working. I'm with the Soil and Water Conservation District, so kind of working with producers to really explain the fine points and where that future might lead them. It could be down a hole or whatever. So thanks very much.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I think that moving forward, we will keep you in mind as well for reaching out to discuss this in more depth.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
And if I could call on somebody else on the call to add to this discussion, I believe, David Nunnally, haven't you, from a locality permitting standpoint, wanted more information on how to categorize the runoff values post-construction, whether it is turf grass or impervious, and if there was ways to build that into questions we might have?
Well, yes, I have raised this question from day one when we started with solar farms. You know, we kind of started with almost a presumption of a totally impervious area to where we are with, I think, with DEQ's position that it's not a totally impervious area, but only certain fixtures within that. So that situation, or that in that one column, that has changed dramatically. I would comment on the one item that bothers me with the solar farms is, you know, the vegetation that's put back is almost entirely fescue. And for Caroline County, we were adopting, or in the works of adopting, a solar ordinance with some guidance requirements. But there's a provision in there that requires mowing every 2 weeks. My suggestion would be to move to some other types of vegetation that wouldn't require that kind of intensive maintenance, and perhaps are more friendly to the environment and to birds or whatever. So that's all I have on that right now.
So I'll add to that. This project that Yada and I have been talking about, we were reached out to by a group, I think out west, looking to us to partner on a grant where we would actually conduct research to look at what kinds of vegetation communities would be ideal to plant under solar panels. And so we don't necessarily have that information yet, but if this grant were to be granted and we were to move forward, that would be something that we would be exploring in this region, as well as working with demonstration sites in the region. So again, it'd be great to be able to reach out to folks in this group to see who already has access to solar fields, or who might be familiar with places that are putting up solar fields where we might be able to experiment with certain types of vegetation communities that can be beneficial to birds and pollinators and other wildlife, and even producers as well.
I'll say that the Virginia Cooperative Extension and maybe Virginia Tech, in partnership with DCR, hosted a webinar and I think an associated guidance document about meadow grasses for solar projects. I sent that link out in a table email, and I can try and dig it back up and give it to Eldon if he wants to distribute it. But there's also a small utility scale solar project in the town of Warsaw, Virginia. Adjacent had conversations with that developer about experimenting with some more innovative grasses than just the fescue, as David mentioned. Just by virtue of it being next to the wildlife refuge, it might be a good opportunity to try and get them in touch with you, Amy, and any of your colleagues that might have interest in that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to Scott, who has successfully unmuted, and you can ask your question now, Scott.
That remains to be seen. Can you hear me, Eldon?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And Amy did answer my question, and I appreciate that. My question was essentially, has there been outreach extended to the ag farming community regarding pasture or hay crop management and bush hogging and when people clip? I know from firsthand experience some of the problems that you can have when you're managing hay crops that you can encounter. Not only killdeer and ducks, but deer and other turkeys and other wildlife as well. And I appreciate that Amy shared a link, and I think everybody got it for that particular guidance. There are a couple on there that I think are meaningful, and I guess this is less a question now since it was answered, and more of a statement that I'd also, as many of us that engage people in the agricultural industry, might suggest that, hey, take a couple 5, 10, 15 minutes and scout the field a little bit just to stir it up if we don't have that flushing bar on the tractor or something like that, that we can stir it up a little bit. So it's less a question and more a statement at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
So this document that I shared, it really is, there's a lot of things on there that work for the landowner that may just be maintaining fields in grasslands and aren't necessarily relying on their fields for hay production or livestock. So in that case, we get phone calls all the time, when is the best time to bush hog? And that risk calendar can really help with that question. But when it comes to intensive hay operations, I mean, we work with a couple of hay producers that provide hay to the local equestrian community where that first cut and that second cut are really important, and the timing is really important. And if we suggest delaying haying until July 1st, well, that just doesn't work for them. That July 1st hay date does not produce a good quality hay. So we're working with American Farmland Trust right now, trying to narrow in on a window where we can say, okay, if you take that first cut off before June 1st, yes, there's a potential that you will impact nesting birds, but it could be early enough that these birds will come back to this field and have a second attempt at nesting. And if we leave that second window long enough, it should allow them to successfully nest. But it's all weather dependent. It's also dependent on how short that grass is cut, so what vegetation remains. The longer the grass is when it remains, the faster the birds will come back in to re-nest. We had a field this year that was hayed really short, less than an inch, and it took the birds about a month before they even came back to start nesting again. And so leaving a 45-day window may not necessarily be long enough. Whereas if you leave a little bit more vegetation, then they come in sooner and successfully fledge out sooner. So this is where it gets really complicated, and our research team is working over the next couple of years to better refine these dates and these windows, and also taking into account like growing days versus specific dates, because we also realize that haying is different every year depending on the weather and the rain. And so we're trying to take that into account to better predict when we can optimize management in a way that can also help grassland birds. But thanks for the
Thank
question.
you. And I don't want to hijack this whole thing, but those are great points. And I think that anybody that's on this call or advocating for the preservation of habitat, as a hay farmer, several things that I do, which you mentioned in here, which is to manage the field and patches, item 4 in the guide. And you can use the influence of weather and say, hey, you don't want to lose your whole crop and cut the whole field at one time. So do the first 10 rounds. And if the rain falls on that, well, you still have the inside. Or then there's also, you don't want to cut it down to an inch. You kind of want to leave 3 to 4 inches so that there's enough energy production for later on in the season. So those are 2 good points. I think that if we're going to speak to the ag industry because we don't want to lose our crops, and we're stewards as well. As environmental farmers are the first environmentalist, as one lender used to say. Thank you.
That's some great feedback too, Scott, and I appreciate your input as a hay farmer. If you have any recommendations as far as language or things we can add to those points that can also touch on the farmer side of things. So for example, American Farmland Trust is helping us adjust our language so that it speaks more to the producer and not as much to the bird lover, so that we're sort of hitting all sides. So if there's any of those points that you have recommendations on how we can better word that in a way that it's more attractive to hay farmers or producers, to anyone on this call, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks.
Thank you. I think Pat Cody, you had a question. You want to unmute?
Yeah, thanks, Alden. Well, really two questions. I'm just curious how many dams there are in the Rappahannock Basin. The second question, is the Smithsonian presentation going to be made available?
Well, I'll answer part of the second question. I'm recording this, and this will be posted to the Tech Committee's past meetings page. Give me a couple days to get it there. But then relative to the PowerPoints, I'll direct that question to Kim.
Yeah, we can definitely, the slides are all online, so we could send the link. I'll send it to Eldon and he could send it around. But I'll also just add in that if any of you are involved in any other groups that think would benefit from hearing from us, we could do this all again at any date in the future. So we're happy to give the same presentation or a variant over and over and over again if you want us to.
All right. What about the question on the number of dams?
Sure. Yeah, I don't have the exact number. It's over 100 based on a quick count. And Eldon, if you can give me permission to share my screen, I can show you. I sent a link to the Chesapeake Fish Passage prioritization tool that was developed for the Fish Passage work group of the Chesapeake Bay program. And I will share that real quick just to show you. So this is a map that shows dams in the Chesapeake watershed, but you can, I'm sure make out the Rappahannock here. So each point on this map is a dam. A lot of them are small dams. And then the color of the points is ranked based on a scenario that maximizes benefit to migratory fish or to brook trout in the upper part of the watershed. So I tried to do a quick count. It's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 100 to 150 in the Rappahannock watershed.
I assume that a large number of those are farm dams, not necessarily on major streams.
For sure. Yep. Yeah. So this data set is from there's a US national dam data set. And so you can actually click on each one of these and get details on exactly what dam it is and some other information about it. But this is Alan Weaver is the Fish Passage Coordinator for, is it Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources now? And we work with him some in the Rappahannock and other places in Virginia. But this is a tool that's the easiest place to go to find out where the dams are. And there's a separate similar effort that's focused on culverts and other kinds of road stream crossings, of which there are, I would guess, over 1,000 in the watershed. But this gives you a sense for dams and is the place where the most information is pulled together to look at the, what the name of the dam is and what, how big it is. And yeah. So.
Thank you. We've also got a question and some information from Sharon Connor. Sharon, can you unmute? Did I catch you off guard? Okay. All right. lost Sharon. Okay. I don't have any other questions in the chat from other folks. Oh, Sharon, you're back with us. You want to unmute and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Actually, I was just making a comment when we were talking about the solar panels and options for grass and habitat in the solar farms. Our experience in Hanover, and I've dealt with quite a few solar farms and trying to write conservation plans, is that most of these solar farms, they scrape the topsoil when they're putting them in. If you've ever seen one of these solar farms go in, it's major construction, and they usually remove all of the topsoil. So coming back and trying to find options for either grazing with sheep or habitat on these farms is almost impossible. So one of the things we would need to start with is to work with the companies that are installing the farms to come up with conservation plans that don't allow for the disturbance of the soil itself. Because when we lose the soil, we lose our ability to manage for whatever we're managing for.
Yeah, that's a good point, good side point. I think scraping the soil does a couple of things. It does also potentially remove the massive amount of invasive species that are probably present. And soil can be rebuilt over a period of time. So perhaps, I mean, I definitely think this is worth a conversation with solar construction firms, because this is going to continue to be a growing issue. But perhaps one solution is to simply have written in contracts to cover crop the area, and then that would help rebuild the soil and remove the potential for invasive species reestablishment, and then also prep it for restoration efforts like what Amy is talking about.
Well, I work with cover crops quite a bit, and if you don't have good soil, it takes years, if not decades, to rebuild a soil where the topsoil has been taken away. I mean, you're almost talking like a mine land. If you've ever worked with mine land reclamation, we're talking about something that's on the caliber of a mine land reclamation. That's what's left once these solar sites go in. So it takes a long time and a lot of nutrients and you know, how are you going to cover crop among all these solar panels? That's also an issue. So I've been trying to write these plans, and it's very difficult to write plans for solar farms to manage when they just, you know, they're not starting off with good management techniques when they're putting these farms in.
Okay, that's good to know. I've asked Meredith via private chat to take note of all the people in this meeting who have mentioned something regarding solar farms, so that Amy and I can then follow up with you, because this is the kind of knowledge that we're going to need. It's going to have to be specific to this region. So thank you for that.
And I will say there's another regional collaborative being hosted out of Virginia Tech. It's the Virginia Soil Health Collaborative. And I think this would be an excellent topic that's more broad reaching than just the development of utility scale solar. I don't like saying the word solar farm because it's not a farm. But I think they would exactly a lot of the points you're talking about rebuilding soil and how to do that for different final land uses. And Emily Francis, who has spoke to the TAC here in the past, would be the best contact to see about building that into their scope.
Okay, I don't see any other oh, wait a minute, let's see. Yeah, you have a comment in there to include Denise Nelson in the solar not farms discussion, since those things don't grow. But and Denise is with the Berkeley group, and they've done quite a bit of consulting with localities that are dealing with applications for land use actions relative to solar utility scale solar facilities. Thank you, Brian.
Alden?
Yes.
I'm trying to put a comment in, but I can't make it. Another question regarding the dam removal. I mean, I appreciate, you know, the benefits there, but what about the effect on flooding and flood control as these dams are removed?
Yeah, you know, I don't know how much of that I can speak to. I've been more focused on sort of understanding the fish and changes to their habitat use. You know, my understanding is that that is a substantial part of the planning that goes into dam removals. And you know, so some of the ones that we've worked on, like the one in Maryland that I showed a picture of, was, you know, wasn't at all related to flood removal. It was an old hydropower dam that was completely silted up, so it was, you know, the water was a few inches deep in the dam pond. So that one wasn't related to flood removal and or to flood management. But that, you know, that certainly is, you know, it's one of the reasons that a lot of dams were built, and I imagine is a consideration for any of the plans to remove dams. Yeah, I think, you know, some of the other places that we've been looking in Maryland and been working on are places where there have been failing dams on private property, and the state's been trying to work with property owners either to repair them or remove them to avoid flood issues. So there was one that in Maryland that failed a few years ago and washed out a road, and that had been on the state's list of high priority dams to work on for a long time because they were concerned about that happening. So I think the flood control can, in some senses, can go both ways there, depending on the dam and the situation around it.
Okay. Other questions?
Eldon, I have one more question if I'm allowed.
Go ahead.
A lot of our partners in the lower Rappahannock are very concerned with sea level rise and its impacts on our coastal communities, flooding septic systems, inundating homes, impacting infrastructure like roads and utilities. And I just wonder if there was opportunity to expand the analyses that the Changing Landscapes Institute is undertaking in your 15 county region and bring in some of the data from VIMS and NOAA on projected climate change models and how that might impact our current communities in the Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula, and how we could help guide comprehensive plans and even some new coastal resiliency funding priorities to help better plan for anticipated.
I think, did that cut out for everyone else at the end there? Okay. Hopefully he's still on the call. Okay.
I'm here. Just applying.
Okay. We lost you for a second. Yeah.
Sorry. Applying some of the analyses that you've undertaken in your 15 county region for coastal resiliency, with the, looking at how sea level rise is going to impact homes and infrastructure in like places like the Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula.
Yeah, I think there is, like I said, we are finishing up our scientific analysis for the 15 counties here. And we're actively looking for other regions to apply the approach that we have already developed. So the learning curve is a little bit lower this time around, I'm hoping anyway. I think this is going to be a good collaboration. Matt here in this meeting with us and I have been talking about combining our efforts together and doing some sort of work on the entire Rappahannock River watershed. And so, this is a conversation I'm totally open to having with you. I think it's definitely in the realm of possibilities. It just requires, thinking about how we would do that and how we would find the funding to be able to make it happen. But the tools are there and the ability is there.
Excellent. I know a couple of our legislators would be very interested in seeing that kind of work take place. And I think the Virginia Institute of Marine Science has a lot of data already that could plug in pretty well to that. Some of our tidal planning districts would also be very interested in that type of analysis.
Okay, Brian, I may follow up with you quickly because Matt and I are putting in a letter of interest for a grant proposal that may help fund this approach. So if you have time and then literally the rest of the week sometime, I would love to be able to talk with you about this.
I'll shoot you an email later today and we'll find a time for a call.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've lost some people, and the reason for that is there is a competing webinar from the Virginia Coastal Policy Center on liability in the face of climate change. And that started at 10, and that's why you saw some people exit, because I knew they were headed out. And I'm going to, I've got, since I don't see any other questions.
Can I make one more?
I have one from Kevin Burns. Go ahead, Kevin. Kevin, you got to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, if you can hear me, Laura, I came in late on the start of your presentation. It looked like from one, is there a GIS-based model scenario planning tool being used in this? And
yeah.
What is it?
We opted for an open source programming language. It's a modular tool called Dynamica. So it was developed within Dynamica. And in this way, it enables me to be able to remove or add components as needed. So a lot of the scenario planning tools are pay to play, and I did not want to do that. Dynamica also gave us the option for considering multiple land use types instead of just development. So I think it was very useful in that sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen, I have one more.
Go ahead, David.
Another sort of parameter that we're dealing with locally in the watersheds is the impairment due to bacteria. And what we're seeing is, historically we kind of blamed livestock, or we blamed failing septics. And now we're seeing it's more related to, almost to me, it's related to a land use and maybe with pets. But that effort from DEQ, coming out of the Clean Water Act, to restore these watersheds and remove that impairment is getting a lot of attention. I would hope that maybe in your studies that you could look at that issue as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. We see the same thing in our local area in Maryland, where there's been a couple of short-term closures of oyster aquaculture sites because of bacterial issues, and our local oyster farmers have been really concerned about that. So we've engaged another one of our colleagues, Katrina Lohan, who isn't on this call, but who has the skills to be able to identify bacterial sources in helping to work on that. And we're just about wrapping that up for our local area. But it's definitely something that we have colleagues who have the capability of doing that kind of work, and a question we've been thinking about, because it is a lot of the bacterial tests that are typically done for water quality don't tell you a lot about the source, as you mentioned, and figuring out that source is really critical to solving the problem. So yeah, it's definitely something that's an opportunity for an issue we can work on.
Okay, thank you. I've got just a couple questions, and I'm going to try to be brief on that, and then if there's anybody else that's trying to get into the other thing, we'll turn you loose. I'd like to see some kind of presentation to the full commission as we move into 2021, and your length of your presentation was actually just about right to get in on a regular commission meeting. Of course, I'd love to be able to do it when we can do it in person, so that you guys would have the opportunity to meet a series of engaged elected officials. You've put forward some things that feed into policy questions, and that is the purpose of the commission coming together and listening, and being able to ask questions. So I'm thinking, I would normally say sooner rather than later, but for the reasons stated, I'm thinking next summer or even next fall. The way you presented this, you've got several years worth of research. Kim, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. We'd be happy to come back, and I love the idea to do it in person. It'd be so nice to get to shake hands and actually meet people. So we can definitely do that whenever things open back up. Put us on the list.
Okay. Then kind of related to that, just listening to the discussion about the timing on some of the research, and Matt, your reference to the data on the oyster reefs is going to be coming in over time. When do you feel would be a good time? I'd like to bring you back to this group, because you get a different level of questions in this group than you're going to get in the commission. The commission is going to be things like, should we be doing something relative to a policy statement on conservation plans on sites for utility scale solar, so they don't strip all the topsoil off? That gets into a bigger policy question, and the relationship between the General Assembly and localities and soil and water conservation districts on those kind of authorities, since we are a Dillon Rule state. But putting the policy aside and more into the technical questions you get here, what would be good timing to bring you back to this group?
Yeah, so we're working on this pilot project right now to assemble a lot of data. So it's an 18-month project, and we've just started it. So maybe beginning of 2022, we would have a lot more information. Does that sound reasonable to everybody else on the data gathering side? And is that too distant in the future for you guys?
No is the short answer. What that would mean is we generally don't meet in December, January, and February. December for obvious reasons, holiday season, but January, February, because the General Assembly consumes so much time for some of us. So it would be late March of 2022, and we just kind of make an agenda note, and that may be a good opportunity. There are some folks on here. Sorry. Pardon. Thought I had that turned off. There are some folks still on this meeting that are not on the River Basin Commission's Technical Committee email list. And my questions, would you like to be added? And we can certainly do that, and just put a note in the chat box, because I will record that, and we'll get you added. I think I've got most of the email addresses because Brian shared them with me. So with that, anything else for the good of the order? All right, anybody who's going to plan on joining the Coastal Policy Center's webinar, you'll only have missed the introductory comments, and you can still make it in. Thank you very, very much. Smithsonian folks, excellent presentation, exciting work. Really going to be the type of material that will inform both implementation and policy discussions going forward. And this is greatly appreciated. Greatly.
Yes. Thank you so much for all of your time as well. It's great to talk to the people who are actually doing the work. So we really appreciate it.
That's most of the other people on this thing, not the person sitting here. I just with.
This is Pat. Thanks, everybody. And Albert, we should have it whenever we get to in person. We should meet up at Front Royal of the Smithsonian.
Well,
yeah, I think I'll speak for Amy and Yara and say you're always welcome. That would be really fun.
I appreciate that. That would be a throwback. I could show you the trees that I was responsible for planting over on the 4-H Center back in the 80s. They're big trees now. We got them off of Airlie, and there's a long story behind it. But the head groundskeeper and I planted about 50 of them, and they'd like to kill us because it was just 2 of us, and they were big trees.
What kind of trees, Eldon?
I don't even remember now. I mean, it was a long time ago, Pat, but it was a memorable project because just because of the scale. But we had them all donated, and we had a hauler donate the hauling, the digging up and hauling. But it was, once they got them to the site, it's up to you guys, and there were only 2 of us. But it was great, and they're all on the front now. They're huge trees. Anyway, that was my first forest conservation project in my career. All right.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday season.
You too. Thank you so much.
Everyone.